Paul to take over. Thank you very much.
Shalom, assalamu alaikum, good evening, tena koto, tena katoa. Haramai, welcome to this Wellington Abrahamic Council event. I'm Paul Morris and your chair this evening for what I hope will be a timely intervention on religious attitudes to racism. I say timely for this is a heightened time. Attitudes are amplified and intensified by the global coronavirus and its uncertainties. Research published yesterday from an Oxford team reported that of 2,500 English people, over 20% considered that Jews were responsible for the coronavirus. A slightly smaller number blamed Muslims, and a slightly smaller number again blamed the Chinese. There's a reported upsurge in racist attacks, cyber attacks, attacks in print and in person, since the beginning of the pandemic. Alongside these, there's a growing awareness of the legacies of the horrors of colonization and resource exploitation, or the corruption underpinning, sustaining, and guaranteeing future racial injustices. There's a hope, more than a glimmer, that the past is on the present's agenda as the basis for real and positive change. Radical changes of attitude and of the system that enshrines these are urgently needed. Religious attitudes to racism are not and have not been one-dimensional and require unprecedented levels of honesty to engage with the terrors and contradictions of the past. We have to all begin with the failure of our past and present co-religionists to prevent racism and even at times to admit that we've fostered it. The portal is opened, but there'll be enormous and ominous pressures for maintaining the status quo, or worse, corporate window dressing for change designed to gaslight us all. My hope is that religions can be a constructive part of this moment and an unambiguous impetus for change. I'm going to now introduce our various moderator and our panelists, just as a long introduction, and then it's over to them. We're blessed this evening with a very fine panel and a fine moderator. Our moderator is Meng Foon, the Race Relations Commissioner. Meng Foon served nearly a quarter of a century on Gisborne District Council and was the Mayor of Gisborne from 2001 to 2019. In August last year, he became our Race Relations Commissioner. And since then, he's been steadily making headlines and having a real impact. He's now responsible for the national campaign, Give Nothing to Racism. Meng speaks Cantonese Chinese and Te Reo Māori and has particular interests. He's the chair of the Gisborne Te Rewhiti Rugby League and a member of the New Zealand Rugby League Board. Kia ora, Meng. Juliet Moses is a law and commerce graduate from the University of Auckland, a partner in the law firm TGT Legal, where she's an expert on trust and estate law. She's the spokesperson for the New Zealand Jewish Council and a frequent media commentator on issues of concern to the Jewish community in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Shalom, Juliet.
Shalom.
Anjum Rahman is a tireless New Zealand advocate for women, for New Zealand women, for Muslim women, and an anti-racist campaigner. Hers was one of the first Muslim families in Hamilton, and her father, that city's first imam. Anjum's been active in this community and beyond in interfaith activities in Hamilton and across the country. Last year, Anjum was made a member of the New Zealand Order of Merit for his services to ethnic communities and to women. A founding member of the Islamic Women's Council of New Zealand, Anjum is a national treasure who in 2019, after Christchurch and the events of March 2019, launched the inclusive Aotearoa Collective to combat discrimination. Anjum, lovely to see you here. Charles Waldegrave is coordinator of the Family Centre, of its Pakeha section, and leader of the Family Centre Social Policy Research Unit. He co-leads two major projects. Firstly, the New Zealand Poverty Measurement Project, which has provided evidence for public policy debates in the country. And secondly, the New Zealand Longitudinal Study of Aging, which has played a very significant role in the national understanding on some of the dynamics of aging in New Zealand. Charles has published widely on social justice, economic deprivation, and mental health in this country. Good evening, Charles. As David said, the format is in that order, starting with Juliet, followed by Anjum, followed by Charles. Three periods of you have got a maximum of 15 minutes each. Then Meng is joining for the full panel discussion, and which he's going to play a leading role as a moderator, and then questions via chat, via David, via me, back to the panel. So, Juliet, it's the microphone is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. Well, because I'm a lawyer, as you've just heard, I'm going to start with a disclaimer, as all good lawyers do, which is that I'm not a religious scholar. I'm, not trained in Judaism or any other religion. So you need to bear that in mind as I'm talking about sort of Judaism's attitudes towards religion, towards racism and its perspective on that. Having said that, I have had a talk to my rabbi to get some ideas from him, and I've done some reading, of course, and it's actually quite interesting because I realise that a lot of views I have on things and a lot of my perspectives that I have on things in this area, I wasn't consciously thinking that it was necessarily a Jewish perspective, but as it turns out it is, or it's very much aligned with Judaism. So just to start off, really the starting point for a discussion on Jewish perspective on racism is that Genesis says every human is made in the image of God. That's a very fundamental point, of course, of our Bible. And that really tells you what the value of human beings is, that humans are all made in the divine image. And therefore, that tells us that every individual is equal, and it tells us about the dignity of the individual. And that actually, at the time, thousands of years ago, that was actually quite a revolutionary idea. It's an idea of humanism, really, and a universalistic concept. And it's very important throughout the Torah, throughout Jewish teachings and traditions. So I think it's important to bear in mind that that's the starting point. And therefore, racism really is a rejection of the very foundation of the Torah. It's not treating people as individuals, it's treating people as a group, and that everybody who belongs to a group, whether it's of a particular race or a particular religion, whatever, it's lumping them all in together and seeing them all as one, and attributing negative characteristics to them. And that creates what we call a Chalal Hashem, which is a desecration of God's name. So the Talmud, our Bible, and the teachings make it very clear that every human, as an image of God, is endowed with three intrinsic dignities, which is infinite value, equality, and uniqueness. Every life is precious. And following on from that, and this is actually something that we talked about last year in the wake of the Christchurch attacks, was that causing a single life to perish, taking a single life away, is tantamount to destroying the entire world. And conversely, saving one life is as if you had saved the entire world. And then, of course, if we talk about Adam and Eve, or Adam, we know that well, according to creation, that Adam was the ancestor of all mankind. And that's also a very important concept because, and you know, whether or not you believe in creation, it still informs a lot of Judaism, because again, it's that concept of we are all descended from the same person. No person can say my ancestor is greater than yours. We've all come from Adam, so we were all created equal. You know, doesn't matter what race or religion or colour we ended up with, we've all got that origin in common. So I think the most famous and important, arguably the most important commandment in the Torah, and it's one that we're all familiar with, and indeed is really, I think, a part of all the main religions in some shape or form, is love your neighbour as yourself. That's from Leviticus. Certainly Rabbi Akiva, who was a very important rabbi, called that commandment, he said it was the central principle of the Torah. You know, it's what we otherwise call or know as the Golden Rule. And I think we all understand that concept of love your neighbour. But in our Bible, it actually goes one step further. So we understand the neighbour as the person next door, the person in the community, the person you know. But our Bible talks a lot about loving the stranger in your midst. And so that's obviously quite a different concept to loving your neighbour. But you're supposed to treat both your neighbours and strangers with love. One of the best examples of that, and I thought it's important to mention because we're talking about Abrahamic faiths today, is in Genesis with Abraham when he's sitting in the doorway of his tent on a hot day, and he's sitting there and waiting, and then 3 strangers come up to him and he rushes out to them and he gives them hospitality, gives them food and water and shelter, and you know, he and his wife Sarah do baking for him, and that was very much about that idea of welcoming the stranger. But actually, probably what you could call Judaism's foundational narrative, or very much a part of our founding story, is emancipation from slavery in Egypt in ancient times, obviously, and being led towards the promised land. And the most important message of Exodus that we celebrate in our festival of Passover is projecting ourselves across time, imagining ourselves as part of the Exodus story. And so we're told in each generation, each person is obligated to see himself as though he or she personally came forth from Egypt. So we're commanded to remember, excuse me, just dabbing my nose, what it was like to be a stranger in the land of Egypt, and to relate that story to ourselves and see it as our own personal redemption. So our job is really, and on Passover in particular, to tell the story about oppression that happened because we were a powerless group of people, a small minority in another land. I think actually read something which I thought was very interesting. Martin Luther King was very influenced by the Exodus story. He referred to it quite a bit. In fact, in his last speech before he died, he talked about standing within sight of the promised land. But I read something that in 1963 he held a conference on religion and race, and the second speaker was Rabbi Abraham Joshua Herschel. And he talked about Judaism's foundational story, and that it was about God taking the side of the victims of racism and oppression. And this is what he said: at the first conference on religion and race, the main participants were Pharaoh and Moses. Egyptians were racist. Though Joseph was second only to Pharaoh, he ate by himself. And then it quotes from Genesis, for the Egyptians could not dine with the Hebrews, since that would be abhorrent to the Egyptians. So I just thought that was a interesting way to look at it, that was the first conference on religion and race, which is the name of the conference that MLK Jr. had convened. the Torah, this is such an important point about welcoming the stranger and loving the stranger, that the Torah repeats it 36 times and reminds us to be empathetic towards the stranger. It's repeated a lot, and it's always with reference to the Exodus story when it's discussed. So Rabbi Soloveitchik said, whenever the Torah wishes to impress on us the mitzvah of having compassion and sympathy for the oppressed in society, it reminds us of our similar helplessness and lowly status during our bondage in Egypt. The most defenseless elements in society are usually the slaves, strangers, widows, and orphans, and we are repeatedly enjoined by the Torah to be sensitive to their plight. The stranger, in particular, personifies the helpless one who has no family or friends to intercede on his behalf. For this reason, as the Talmud indicates, the Torah exhorts us in 36 references to treat the stranger kindly. So, that's very much an important theme right through the Torah. I'll quote to you one part from Leviticus. We find this commandment: when strangers reside with you in your land, you shall not wrong them. The strangers who reside with you shall be to you as your own citizens. You shall love the stranger as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So, as I say, that's a very important thing that gets repeated right the way through the Torah. Just see how we're going for time. So just moving on from there, the flip side to loving the stranger is not hating the stranger, and that's less well known, but that's also an important commandment in the Torah. And in fact, it says, which is quite interesting, in Deuteronomy, do not hate an Egyptian because you are strangers in his land. And that means, that seems almost a bit counterintuitive, but what it's saying is don't hate somebody because they oppressed you. You will be still a slave, a mental slave. You will be bound by the chains of hate if you can't let go of what happened to you. So I think that's a very interesting idea as well, that you need to be able to free yourself from hatred in order to be able to sort of move on. It's quite an interesting. I didn't realize that it's sort of the Torah talked about that, but it says it's saying you must live with the past, but not in the past, and don't be captive to your anger and your hatred. So I thought that was interesting. So really, the whole point is it's about recognizing the individuality of each person, but also recognizing it within ourselves, that we've got the capacity to love and do good, but we've also got the capacity to hate. Judaism doesn't have that concept of original sin, that we're all born in sin, but it certainly has the concept that hate and doing bad is in all our human nature. We all have that capacity, and we all have to work hard and do good deeds to overcome it. So as much as seeing everybody else as individuals and treating them as individuals, we have to recognize that we are also individuals who've got, as I say, the capacity to do good and also the capacity to do bad. So there's a story in Jewish law about a man who stood before God with a broken heart from all the pain and injustice in the world. And I think this is quite relevant for now. He said, dear God, he cried out, look at all the suffering, the anguish and distress in your world. Why don't you send help? And God responded, I did send help. I sent you. And, Martin Luther King, going back to that again, said darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Hate multiplies hate. Violence multiplies violence, and toughness multiplies toughness. So I thought that was interesting. And then now for my last minute or 2 minutes, I'll just say something about the concept of Jewish chosenness, because I think this is something people might be interested in. I think it's an understood idea, misunderstood idea, the concept of Jews as the chosen people. I think that's been a cause of a lot of anti-Semitism, because people think it means that Jews think somehow they're, it's an idea of Jewish supremacy, or that Jews are special. And it doesn't mean that. It means that, or most people interpret it to mean that Jews have a covenant with God and a special responsibility to act on God's word. But it has been a source of a lot of anti-Semitism, and I have to say that it certainly has been used and is used by some Jews probably to justify a sense of supremacy, or make them think that they are supreme, because like all people, we obviously do have racism in our midst amongst our people. We can probably talk more about that at the end, but really I just wanted to touch upon that point right now, and then maybe we can talk more about kind of what's going on in the world right now later on when we have our panel discussion. That's it from me for now.
You can do it. Thank you. And Juliet, thank you. I'm unmuted now. And Anjum, the floor is yours.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Tēnā koutou katoa. First of all, I'd like to greet you all and acknowledge Mana Whenua for wherever you are sitting, and for their generosity by which we are here on this land. And Juliet, listening to you once again just reminded me how much familiarity there is between what you speak of in Judaism and what we know in Islam, and I'm sure Christianity, it is the same, and we know that from years of interfaith work. And when I heard you talking about neighbours and that notion of killing one person being equal to killing all humanity, all of those things, it just resonated so strongly with me, so thank you for that. For me, I see racism as one part of wider discrimination, but that notion of anti-racism, I feel like it was an inbuilt part of who I am, both from my faith and from my own experiences, how I was treated personally. So yes, Paul, we were the first Muslim family to settle in Hamilton, and I happened to be in a neighbourhood and a school where there were no people that weren't Pakeha or Māori. So I was different, personified, that was my lived experience. And of course, I grew up as a teenager with the anti-apartheid movement and the rugby match in Hamilton and all of those things. But what I also recall is so many Islamic lectures, sermons, explanations of Quranic verses, the history from the life of the Prophet and early Muslims. And, we would get visitors to our home from around the country and the world. The first Friday prayers were at our house. And it's really, I'd like to tautoko and honour my parents who made the efforts to make so many connections and to get people into our home and bring the community together so that we could learn these things. And so it's very clear from the Quran. And I thought I'd go through a few Quranic verses that speak to this notion around racism. So the first one from Surah An-Nisa, chapter 1, O mankind, be careful of your duty to your Lord who created you from a single soul, and from it created its mate, and from them twain has spread abroad a multitude of men and women. And this notion of creation, you also, Juliet, mentioned Adam and Eve, and that is our story of how humanity began. And another verse of the Quran says, O mankind, indeed we have created you from male and female, and made you peoples and tribes that you may know one another, Indeed, the most noblest of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous of you. Indeed, Allah is knowing and aware. And I think this is probably one of the most quoted verses of the Quran, and yet still very much loved by me, because it's this notion of us being made different and looking different and so on, that is treated as a gift. It's something that was given to us. Excuse me. And so it's something for us to cherish and appreciate. And another one is, from chapter 30, verse 22. And amongst his wonders is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the diversity of your tongues and colours. For in this, behold, there are messages indeed for all who are possessed of innate knowledge. So, I love the tying of this to education, of learning and knowing. And again, I love it, that is part of creating heaven and earth, that this diversity of us as humans is part of the miracle and the wonder of creation. And we also know about race and racism from the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And again, one of the most quoted things is his last sermon, when he went to Mecca for Hajj. He was living in the city of Medina, and at that time he gave a sermon that is read widely, at least definitely within the Muslim community. And as part of it, he said, "O people, your Lord is one and your father Adam is one. There is no favor of an Arab over a foreigner, nor a foreigner over an Arab, and neither white skin over black skin, nor black skin over white skin, except by righteousness. Have I not delivered the message?" And so, again, I love that racism is directly addressed. It's directly in your face addressed, that is not acceptable, and that is actually our conduct and our behavior, our acts of worship that mean anything, and not how we look. I'll just go on. I've got a couple more here. Sorry, just bear with me a minute. Also in the Quran, another aspect around racism is how we conduct ourselves in our language and how we talk about each other. And in this social media day and age, where people just whip off the nastiest comments, and it is also, a political tool to inflame our emotions to get us engaged, and so to inflame hatred, to inflame othering. And so, it's a model. It's how often social media companies gain income, because the more outrageous a thing you say, the more hits you're going to get, the more shares you're going to get, even though a lot of the people that are sharing it to speak against what you said. That amplifies the message still. And so it's kind of built into the design of the system that outrage gets rewarded, outrageous comments get rewarded. And so people become more and more extreme to get attention. And so I think it's really important for me and for us, I think, as Muslims, to think about how we're told to conduct ourselves as we speak to and of one another. Excuse me, I'm just going to drink a bit of water. So in one of the verses of the Quran, it says, "O you who believe, let not one people laugh at another people, perchance they may be better than they. Nor let women laugh at other women, perchance they may be better than they. And do not find fault with other people, nor call one another by nicknames. Evil is a bad name after faith, and whoever does not repent, he it is who is unjust." So you know, and there are so many hadith, so many sayings of the Prophet, so much behavior in that regard that is warning us about guarding our tongue, about thinking about what we say before we say it, about saying a good thing and leaving off saying a bad thing. And more than that, you know, the notions of equality that between people. So the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said that people are like the teeth of a comb, and that there is no claim of merit over another, whether it's male or female or whatever skin color. I think also for us, racism so much and wider discrimination is tied up with the notion of arrogance. So when we think about the fall of Satan, or at least as we call him, that the story that we have in the Quran about his fall from grace was about arrogance, his arrogance of seeing himself as better than Adam because he was made from fire and Adam was made from clay or dirt, and failing to, failing to obey an order to bow before Adam because he saw himself as superior. And I think that for me especially, I really feel like racism is an act of arrogance and superiority. It is ultimately thinking yourself or your kind is better than someone else or their kind. And we have no basis to make that judgment. We can't see into the minds, the motivations, the life history, the experiences, the capacities, all the things that make up a person that lead them into the things that they do or where they're at. They're not visible to us. And I think part of the work that we've been doing at Inclusive Aotearoa in the last few months has been around having in-depth conversations with people around the country and people from a whole range of diversities, not just ethnic or cultural. And, you know, I thought I knew a thing or two about my fellow Kiwis. You know, I thought that I got around. I thought I met and listened to and heard from over the course of my life a whole lot of diverse people, and that I consciously made that decision to do so. And so, again, it was an arrogance on my part. And, you know, I'm very woke. I know where it's at. But the one thing that it has taught me is that I really don't know much at all. And listening to people and listening to them relate their experiences of belonging and not belonging and what they're living with or what they have lived through just really reinforced for me how important it is to not be judging people by what we only see from our own eyes. You know, and that how much you need to take the time to ask the right questions and get to know a person before you fully understand who they are. I think for me also in Islam, one of the most important things is the performative reminders of equality. And so when we pray, and you will all have seen pictures of Muslims praying in rows, one after the other, and we stand in front of God, and I mean, there's Urdu poetry, there's, you know, so much written about the fact that it doesn't matter if you're the king or you're the servant. When you stand in front of God in equal rows, that you're all equal. And it just reinforces that notion that you are equal in front of God, except by your own conduct, your own piety, your own worship, and your own behavior towards others. But also in Hajj, you know, we go for our pilgrimage. We should go once in a lifetime to Mecca. And when we go for Hajj, like the men are required to wear 2 pieces of unsewn cloth, and everyone is required to do that. For women, generally we'll wear an abaya and a white piece of cloth over our head. But it is again meant for us to remember that we have that when we're there, and it translates to all of our life, that we are essentially equal, no matter what our status, no matter how much wealth we've accumulated or inherited, no matter what color of our skin, that in the eyes of God, it is once again a reminder that we are all equal. You know, the mosque in Hamilton, we have 42 ethnicities, and in Ramadan, I'll go to the mosque, except for this year because of COVID. So that was another blessing. But you know, we stand in these rows, and I have my Afghani sisters, my Malay sisters, South Asian, Somali, Djibouti, Nigerian, Pakeha, and I think in that sense, having a smaller community means that we're so much blessed because we all go to the same place and we get to interact. And we've had to deal with the fact in New Zealand that we have Muslims coming from all over the world who have very different practices, and learning to negotiate all those differences. So, you know, just to finish, like I've talked about our faith, I've talked about what we are taught, what the examples that we've given. Unfortunately, you know, sometimes the reality is something different, and what our cultural or learned behaviour, and this is seen in all communities, and despite the knowledge that sits within us about our faith, that the environment we live in tends to affect us, and the fear of the familiar tends to affect us. And I think that's why going back to this knowledge, going back to what we've seen and what we know, and reminding ourselves often is so important. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjum. I was just waiting to be unmuted. Thank you very, very much. And our third and final speaker, I can no longer see him on my screen, is Charles, who I will try and locate.
Should I just speak? Does that bring it up?
Ah, there you are. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Kei te whakamoemiti ki te atua, mō ngā manakitanga, me ngā āwhina ki a mātou. Nā rangatira mā tēnā koutou, mihi nui, mihi aroha ki a koutou. Nau reira tēnā koutou, kia ora koutou katoa. Shalom alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Greetings to all of you, and thank you to the Abrahamic Council to pull this forum together. Greetings to the other speakers, ko Juliet, roa ko Anjum, tēnā kōrua, ko Paul, roa ko Meng, tēnā kōrua, mihi aroha kia koutou. Racism is a blatant denial of the Christian faith, as it clearly is of the other two faiths. And this is so, firstly, because it denies, as Juliet has said, our common humanity in creation and our belief that all people are created in God's image. Secondly, it falsely asserts that we find our significance in terms of racial identity rather than in our shared identity as human beings. And thirdly, it unjustly emphasizes the principles of superiority and social exclusion rather than the reconciling principles Jesus taught of serving others and loving one's neighbor as the overriding principles of faith, justice, and social inclusion. So, religious attitudes to racism, where does one start? In the Christian tradition, we've both failed miserably and succumbed to the horrors of racism, and on other occasions led the charge demonstrably against it. We have much to confess and much to celebrate. And one has to say, there is so much more to achieve, as the Black Lives Matter movement shows. The evidence of persistent inequities that Maori and Pacific people experience at the hand of the police and the criminal justice systems in this country is a further example of what has yet to be achieved. Sadly, in countries where Christianity is the predominant religious tradition, racism is still alive and well, despite laws that are designed to prevent it. The challenge to purge our attitudes and institutions of racism or the softer phrase racial bias, is immense, but not unachievable. In this dialogue, facilitated by the Abrahamic Council, I feel I must acknowledge the appalling history of racism carried out by Christians against Jews and Muslims in various countries and on differing historic occasions. This is not the time to detail all of those, but it would be insincere not to identify the recurring historical phases of anti-Semitism in Europe, the Crusades in the Middle Ages, the Crusades in the Middle East and Africa, the relentless genocide of Jews in World War II, and the ethnic cleansing campaign in Bosnia and Herzegovina, culminating in the massacre of more than 8,000 Muslims in Srebrenica as recently as 1995. Of course, the concentration camps of World War II and the massacres in Srebrenica were not planned and organized by the Christian Church, but they resulted from deep racial stereotypes that persisted in societies whose predominant religion was Christian. There are numerous instances where the church was compliant with these stereotypes, and of course many instances where it repudiated them. In the final analysis, though, the struggle against these racial stereotypes was insufficient, inadequate, and ineffective through most of our joint history to prevent these and other horrible spillovers. I acknowledge this because I want to talk about hope. I want to share aspects of the unsullied part of our tradition that stood against racism and achieved change that has improved those societies. Stories that drew deeply on the teaching of Jesus and not only refused to tolerate racism against their own, but went on to embrace those who had treated them so badly. I can only do this with integrity by also fully admitting the deep failures in our tradition, which cannot be excused, and also by listening attentively to both our other presenters in this forum, Jewish and Islamic traditions in this forum. Martin Luther King Jr., who's already been quoted in this forum, was an African-American Baptist minister and the first president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conferences in the United States. As you know, he was an activist who was the spokesman and leader of the civil rights movement in that country from 1955 until his assassination in 1968. He successfully advanced civil rights through nonviolence and civil disobedience, inspired by his Christian beliefs and the nonviolent activism of Mahatma Gandhi. You will no doubt be aware of his most famous speech in 1963 at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., where he gave hope by saying, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed." The creed he was referring to was the Declaration of Independence, and he went on to quote it. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Of course, if that declaration was written today, it would say all people are created equal. "I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today." Archbishop Desmond Tutu is a South African Anglican cleric and theologian. As you well know, he was an anti-apartheid and human rights activist, and is still considered today to have provided much of the moral conscience of South Africa through his support of Nelson Mandela, his articulation of the values in the fight against apartheid, and setting up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in that land. His leadership and that of Mandela is largely credited with the peaceful transition from apartheid to universal suffrage and avoiding a racial civil war. He was a Christian theologian, and he said this: if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you've chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse, you say that you are neutral. The mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. A little later, he helpfully said, do your little bit of good where you are. It's those little bits of good put together that overwhelm the world. These two understood the essence of a Christian theology of race relations, and they gave their lives to that struggle. They were too radical for some and too soft for others, but their nations changed because of their leadership and persistence. When Jesus in the Gospel of St. Luke invited a lawyer to sum up the essence of faith, he said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Jesus affirmed his statement, and the lawyer went on to ask, who is my neighbor? Jesus told a parable which had many points about society and oppression, but one of the most important was about race. A man was severely beaten and robbed and left on the road for dead. Two senior religious people passed by the man without helping him. One was a priest and one was a Levite with a priestly heritage. It was very shocking to the crowd that these two walked past a person in such distress. But it was not as shocking as the next part of the story, where a Samaritan was seen as the one who acted in a godly way. He bandaged the man's wounds, put him on his donkey, took him to the nearest inn, and paid for his time of recovery there. There was at that time huge distrust between Jews and Samaritans. A century before Jesus' birth, the Jews, in an expansionist move, destroyed the Samaritan sanctuary and the city on Mount Gerizim. And the Jewish historian Josephus reported that around the time of Jesus' birth, a group of Samaritans had desecrated the sanctuary of the temple in Jerusalem by scattering dead bones across it. There were numerous other nasty incidents on both sides. It was impossible and even shocking for a Jewish village at that time to think there could be a good Samaritan. Samaritans were viewed with suspicion and hostility by Jews in and around Jerusalem at that time. Both had developed a racial stereotype of the other, despite the fact they were by heritage cousins. Jesus used a racially despised person to demonstrate the way of God and the way of love. The story of the Good Samaritan is a parable to help us look beyond our own traditions and to see the good in people we distrust because of our prejudices. It is an anti-racist parable. Some in the crowd marveled. Others were horrified and began to plot his death. All this has implications for us today. Stopping racism in Aotearoa New Zealand requires changes in our social, economic, and judicial systems. Martin Luther King Jr. and his colleagues worked for systemic change in their country and achieved a lot. But as we all know, there is still a long way to go to eliminate racism. Likewise, Archbishop Tutu and his colleagues achieved an enormous amount of structural change and helped free the whole country from an apartheid regime. Time allows me only one example of systemic racial bias in New Zealand, that requires changing, but it illustrates one of many changes that are required. For 30 years to 2005, Māori made up 40% of those imprisoned in New Zealand, despite being around 15% of the population. They now make up over 50% of those imprisoned, despite being 16.5% of the population. Studies show, and the Ministry of Justice accepts, that at every stage of the criminal justice system, Māori are treated more harshly than non-Māori. This is because there is some discretion for decision makers all the way through. For the same offence, and I repeat that, the same offence, Māori are more likely than non-Māori to be apprehended, then more likely to be prosecuted, then more likely to be convicted, and finally more likely to receive a harsher sentence. These are all for the same offences. The culmination of each of these biases leads to the extraordinary unequal ethnic prison rates. This is but one of the substantial racial challenges that confront us, who refer to ourselves as Christians, and I know it's true of the other faiths too. It is a tough call to eliminate racism. While some are deeply committed, many of our people in the Christian church only go as far as their own personal morality. They try not to be racially biased themselves, but don't get the point the Archbishop made about neutrality and the mouse when it comes to social and systemic change. In my view, this is the primary challenge we have in our churches regarding religious attitudes to racism. The time now is right to act on the challenge. Will we? I don't know, but we have the mentors, the saints of our tradition, as we all have in our traditions. There is really no excuse for us to do nothing while the elephant is standing on the tail of a brother or sister. Thank you.
Charles, thank you. Thank you. We've heard from our three speakers. We now have an opportunity for the speakers to engage with Meng Foon and with each other, and perhaps a segue in is where Charles our first two speakers had a very individual focus, and the last speaker's focus was largely ended with the issue of systemic racism and of system change. To put it much more dramatically than Charles did, Pope Francis said that it's no longer enough, it's no longer sufficient to be a good Samaritan. The sort of change that is required requires something beyond that. And so the speakers should take this 10-minute opportunity to engage with each other and with Meng. And Meng, it's over to you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you to all our speakers. And assalamu alaikum, shalom, tēnā koutou, mō koutou whakaro I te rānei, and to our organisers of the Abrahamic speech event today. I just want to sort of capsulate some of the thoughts, and so we sort of agree that we're born equal. We come from God, a faith, and that somewhere along the line it went wrong. Somewhere along the line that we decided that power was more important than being equal, regardless of our colour. As we know that human beings, in terms of human rights, we are born equal. We are just humans of many colours, many beliefs, many faiths, and many minds. I'm interested in how can we change what we're doing, because what we're still doing seems to be ending up to be more. racism and systemic issues. And one of the areas was in education, where when I first came into the role, the ERA report for our schools was 30% of our children, our students, were bullied on a daily, weekly basis. That's 250,000 children. That's bigger than most cities. And if it was in a city, there would be rampant riots, killing of each other, terrible situation. And so, and then this year, it actually raised to 35%. And so we said to the ministry, you can't continue what you're doing, you have to do something different. And so they're looking at different ways of doing stuff, implementing programs, and but they're only looking. I'm sure through their models around the world where maybe there is less bullying and racism and discrimination in the education sector, we can just pull those good components out and implement them here. So, you know, Dave, you mentioned that if we continue to act the same, we're going to end up with the same similar results or worse. And so, you know, my question sometimes is put to people, should we actually have religious studies of many types or value studies in our schools, in our education system, because there seems to be that part that is missing from our curriculum.
Can I just come in here? You've got two questions, Meng, you've raised for the other speakers. The first question is, how can we change? And as you rightly said, we're all against racism, but, and it's that big but. And you raised a second issue about education, and that certainly might well be part of the response to how we might change. But if we go back to Juliet, Juliet, how might we change?
Well, I'll speak for myself. Since this whole thing kicked off with George Floyd's death, what I've been trying to do is, it's pretty simple, just listen and learn. You know, I haven't understood, I don't think, the full aftermath of slavery in the United States, how little redress and you know, reparation and discussion and reconciliation there's been around that. I just haven't really understood the ongoing, you know, partly it's probably because I'm not that familiar with US history, or not as familiar perhaps as I should be, but I haven't heard the stories, I haven't heard the voices for whatever reason. So part of it, I think, as simple as it sounds, is just opening your mind up and listening to these things, and so, you know, that's what I've been trying to do, just really listen to, in the States, for example, you know, the voices of the Black American population there. In New Zealand, I think it's, again, just about listening to Maori. It's not about centering ourselves, it's about listening to them and sort of empowering them as much as possible to speak and to come up with the solutions with our assistance. But I think, you know, it comes from them. Just very quickly as well on the education piece, and I saw David Hines was on the call before, there's a survey that some of us have just completed about the role of religion in schools and what we think it should be. It's been circulated around some of the communities. And personally, I do believe that in state schools there should be not religious instruction by any stretch, but I do think it's important for students in Aotearoa to learn about the different religions and the different values. I think we are a very secular society, and I think there is an antipathy towards religion generally. There's this idea that religion is bad, it's been a force for evil in the world, and we all know that there is some truth to that. But I think, like just the things we've been talking about tonight, children should be taught that. They should understand all the good things that religion can teach you and the ways that it can help to improve the world as well. And also it just helps to understand about the diversity of our country, which is, as we all know, very diverse, and to respect the other, and as we've been talking about, respect the individual, and the differences between us, but our shared humanity.
Thank you. Charles, would you like to, you raised formally the systemic issue.
Yes, I think part of the problem we have in our churches is that churches is often a space for comfort, for peace, for the inner life and those sorts of aspects, all of which are really important. But they can lull us into a disregard of the things that are going on in society and the mission in the sense of social justice. So I think there's quite a lot that needs to be woken up about that in our traditions to be able to make a change. We, for example, I also do a day a week as a vicar at St. Peter's in Willis Street, and we held a vigil to try and address this in memory of George Floyd's funeral. And we got the police commissioner, Kim Workman, who was done the most research and work on the bias within the racial bias within the criminal justice system, and Laura Rapira from Action Stations. And on a lousy windy night, we got over 250 people in the church and live streamed and got a really good debate. But it was also a vigil where we could actually turn some prayers and meditation around those lines to try and energize people, not just people in our church, but the city as well. And it got, the commissioner said some things publicly that are now on the record that were fairly progressive. So I think there's things that we can do. I think the education idea is a very good one. I don't think we should be teaching religious studies in the way that they have been taught in schools, primarily Christian. I think they would definitely need to be seen as a much more broader look at religious traditions, all religious traditions, but that and values, and also provide some challenge to secularism to get a perspective on all of that. I think those things would help. But I think the hardest thing is to get the urgency among people to really want to change these things, because they're so hard to change. And even when one generation changes them, the next generation can change them back again. And so it's a persistent life struggle.
Thank you. Anjum?
Yes, thanks, Paul. It's interesting, I found your comment really interesting about systemic stuff, because with Muslims, of course, we don't have that kind of hierarchy, and we don't see religion as an institution, and we don't have these kind of edicts and so on. And so therefore, like when you look at something like Catholicism and you have the Pope at the top and it comes down from there, we certainly don't have anything like that. But in terms of what Meng is talking about, one of the things that came to my mind immediately was the fact that religious leaders have access to large audiences, and that it's really important that they're engaging with this material. So not just in terms of, and I know I took it from a historical and from a scriptural, textual perspective, but then translating that into people's lives today and putting that forward. You know, if we're at talking about the mosque in Hamilton, there's well over 500 people there of a Friday, and across the country. And then the other avenue is that pretty much every religion in this country has religious schools going in some form or another, whether it's Sunday school or the madrasas at the mosque or so on. And here is another avenue to put forward within our own faiths, you know, some messages that can be contemporary as well as going to the roots of the faith, you know, that can be put forward. So we don't just have to rely on schools, which is not to say I totally agree that we should teach about religions in schools. I think we've been, you know, talking about that for a few decades now, but and I think it's useful, but I think there are also these other mechanisms, and I think as the Human Rights Commission, excuse me, I don't know what's going on with my throat today. I think it might be useful for you guys to get together with some religious leaders and put together some resources from different religious viewpoints that could be used in religious schools and for sermons and so on to allow for that dissemination of a different message that could have impact.
We've got a page, 2 pages of questions, so I should raise some of the questions for the panel. The first question is, how can we best support anti-racism overseas, campaigns overseas, while working on eliminating racism in Aotearoa? Is there a way of balancing of that? Should we be involved overseas? Does it detract from what we're doing? Anyone among the panel, please come in. Anjum, you're in.
I think it's really important to strengthen and listen to what people are doing in those countries. So I think it's very important that we don't step in to solve those problems, but you know, and that's for, you know, for all I've said about social media, one of the benefits that I have of social media, and particularly in terms of Twitter, is following a lot of different, for example, Black Americans and non-politicians, politicians, so on, to hear about what they're talking about, what their initiatives are, and they're very often sharing, please support this, please put money into that, please help disseminate this. And so I feel like in terms of overseas, it's really, really important, if you want to be an ally, is to amplify the voices of those people rather than putting our own voice in that space. And it's really important because then it gets everyone into the space of listening to others that are different to themselves. So yeah, that's one thing that I would say in terms of an international space.
That's very clear, thank you. Did other members of Juliet or Charles or Meng would like to address that particular?
Yeah, it's really unfortunate that it actually takes overseas events to actually highlight probably the issues of overseas, but we in New Zealand are in denial. We have a look at the Springbok tour and apartheid in South Africa. Yet we went out there protesting, we felt good about protesting, and we felt good about participating, but did we change anything? Did the laws change for us? And, you know, Dave has mentioned more Māori are in jail because they've been picked on. The health system, the justice system, education system, and so it goes on. And so, you know, I like that comment of Dave, Charles, that regarding racism, we're in constant denial of the issue. So before we can, you know, and he went on to say that, look, we as Christians did terrible things. And it's not that till we actually acknowledge that we have done terrible things and Chinese people have done terrible things to Chinese people and other people, is that we can actually say hand on heart that we want to change and that we won't want to do terrible things, but we've got to acknowledge that. There's no good being, I'm not racist, but we need to be anti-racist.
I think partly I agree totally with Anjum and Meng, but just thinking about what you said, Meng, I think sometimes it's easier, isn't it, to point the finger at others overseas in America or South Africa or wherever it is than to solve the problems right at our front door. You know, it's just easier to show our support for other people and not do the hard stuff we need to do at home. Not saying it's a good thing, but I think it's just what happens.
If we might raise another issue, one of the questions has asked what do we do with bad texts in our own traditions? They've listed them. I'm not going to read out the bad texts, but what do we do with the pejorative texts in the Old Testament, the Torah, the New Testament, these interpretations that come out of the Quran and the Hadith? How do we wrestle with these texts that generate dissent and hatred that arise again and again within our own traditions? Charles.
Yes, well, it's a very good question. I think it's really important to deconstruct them, basically to have to be much more informed about our faiths. A lot of people in our tradition are not all that informed, and so you get these statements. We've got them, for example, against gay people and stuff in the New Testament, and they need to be deconstructed. They need to be put in context of the time, and also what the nature of this writing is. That it's you know, the overall writing is inspired by God, but it doesn't mean that every point in it, you know, needs to be followed in the modern world in the same sort of way. And to try and help people understand the overriding principles, you know, which I feel all the speakers have done today. There are overriding principles about loving your neighbor and about serving other people and about caring for the stranger and the sorts of things we've heard, that these override sort of detail. So I think a lot more information in our traditions would help.
Would any of the other speakers like to respond to that particular issue?
Oh, sorry, Andrew. I'll just say I agree with Charles. It's very much about putting things in context. And I think it's also important that, you know, we obviously, all religions have their fundamentalists or extremists, whatever you want to call them, who will seize upon one particular, you know, sentence or whatever it is and decide that tells them what they should do. And it's not something that's good. But it's very important as well that we have leaders and religious leaders who don't think like that to speak out and to be very clear that that is not, you know, a guiding principle, or that's not the way we interpret it these days, or that might have been in the context, you know, thousands of years ago, but now, you know, we've moved on. So I do think it's important as well that we have leaders who make that very, very clear.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Yeah, I did want to say, because of course we are sitting in a space as well where we've seen people that have used Islamic text and so on, Hadith and Quran, to justify some atrocious acts. And, you know, again, for me, one of the things is it comes back to that amplification. So X says something awful or stupid, that is big news, it reaches across the globe. Y says something reasonable and whatever, you know, more aligned with what the teachings are, not news. Doesn't reach anywhere, you know. And I remember talking to a Kuwaiti foreign minister or something many years ago, and he was like, you know, Osama bin Laden will say X and it'll be across the world, and I I say something, and I'm lucky if my local newspaper publishes it. And so, again, that then comes back to, you know, what power we have in our hand, which is don't publicize the rubbish, publicize what you see of good, and try and do what you can to amplify that.
No, that's right. On that question, one of the other questions raises the issue. One of the things that Anjum just raised was the concern with good information and bad information. How is how might we address the kind of unconscious bias and the kind of implicit racism that we find in New Zealand business and the media? I mean, how is the best way to approach this?
I'd be happy to say some things about that. So one of the most important things, I think, is to put yourself in spaces where people are different to yourselves, to put yourself, you know, think of the amount of time, and for different people this will vary. How much time have I spent really interacting with people who are socioeconomically more deprived than me? How much time have I spent really interacting with someone with a disability? How much time have I spent talking to a transgender person? You know, like, and because the human tendency, and this is, you know, when we talk to people about belonging, the first thing they say is, I want someone with the same values, I want someone who thinks like me, and so on. And then they say, I want someone who accepts me as I am. But then you have to do that for other people too, right? And so how are you going to accept them as they are until you sit and listen to them and go to places where it will be uncomfortable, and that you're going to be okay to sit with that discomfort and listen, and not charge in to say things, just sit and listen.
But and clearly that's not what's happening in business and the media.
Yeah, because
it's unlikely. Yeah. Juliet, when you've written letters to the editor and you've complained about what you've seen as prejudicial and negative and ill-informed reportage, have you been satisfied that things have changed?
Sometimes, yes. I haven't written any letters to the editor for a while, but you know, I have found the media, I think, more willing to listen. I think partly, you know, there are some smaller but other organisations now and outlets who are, you know, more open to a different point of view. Just as one example, last year, you know, there was a BSA ruling that came out in relation to, I didn't even know that it happened, but I think it was on Sky Sports, and a Crusaders, a player for the Crusaders, makes a joke in quotation marks, about someone being a Jew, meaning greedy and, you know, stingy and whatever. And this was on live TV. And the BSA came out with a ruling that said that, yeah, not great, yeah, it's a stereotype, but we don't find it a breach of the BSA standards, you know, denigrating people on the basis of race or religion or whatever the exact wording is. And I actually got approached by the spin-off to write a piece on that. They actually contacted me and said, could you write about that? And so, you know, that was really good, because it was an opportunity for me to explain to people why that is a damaging stereotype with a very, very long and nasty history. And, you know, so I was really pleased to actually be offered that opportunity. I think a lot of it is about engagement and education, and yes, it can be, you know, it can be really hard, you know, getting through or making that sort of first contact with business or media or whatever it is, but you've just sort of got to keep trying. And I think if you can do it on that one-to-one basis, and you do approach it from a sort of an engagement and education perspective, I think, you know, you've got a better chance of being heard. And I'll just very quickly, I noticed in the Herald yesterday there was a discussion about Black Lives Matter and about how the Herald's reported on things in the past, and whether it's done so in a racist way or using negative stereotypes or whatever. And I noticed that the Auckland representative of Black Lives Matter refused to talk to the Herald because this person said because the Herald's upheld white supremacy, and it's not the representative's job to sort of teach the Herald and give the Herald examples of how they failed and stuff. And I thought, well, put it this way, that's not my way of doing things. I mean, it shouldn't be the job of that person to have to do that, but if you do want to try and combat racism, you have to sometimes help people to understand and educate them. You shouldn't have to do it, but sometimes, we're not in an ideal world, and that's what you do need to do.
We've got a number of other questions, so we'll try and get 3 or 4 more in, so these require rather truncated responses, I think, from you. But one question that's raised, I mean, what is the role of religious leadership in being more proactive in terms of addressing racism in Aotearoa? I mean, is there a particular role for religious leadership?
Yeah, I think that religious leadership doesn't have the pulling power that it used to have, and possibly because it actually hasn't addressed these issues adequately. That any religious leader, if they want to get on the media and have some influence in a society, then beyond their own members, then they've actually got to put up a really good case, and they've got to be sort of competitively adequate and up with other groups that are competing for that space. But I don't think we should be dismal. I mean, we have actually achieved a lot in this country in terms of race relations. We've got a long way to go, a very long way to go. But we have achieved a lot. And it's happened, and the church has taken quite some leadership in that process. Religious leaders have in this country. And it's led to laws. It's led to, I mean, just most recently, look at the flack the National Party got for not having Māori at the top end of their leadership. Now that wouldn't have happened, a decade ago, I don't think, or certainly 2 decades ago. And when you think of, someone brought up the Springbok tour, like we were in those struggles, but what it did at the end of that was to say, we got really challenged by Māori. It said, well, how come you're fighting this fight over there? What about right here? And all sorts of organizations got going, and there was a lot of leadership from the churches and that. So we've got a long way to go, and we don't always do it very well, but we shouldn't be hopeless. But there are examples of things we've achieved, and especially in this country.
Do the others of you wish to comment on that?
Yeah, I think the Human Rights Commission now is embarking on a treaty-based organisation, and it's a huge paradigm shift for us. And sharing decision making and ensuring that Māori actually have rangatiratanga. In all that they do, which means control the things that they own, control the aspects of their culture, control the aspects of their economy, and enable to do that for future generations. And on the other side is the kāwanatanga, which is all of us that have come to this country. And so the sharing of decision making would go some way in addressing what was originally intended through the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi. And I always thought, what would it be like to live in that world? Would we be better, or would we be the same, or would we be worse? Hopefully it would be better, because when one goes to a marae, doesn't matter who you are, whether you're an arch enemy and you've had an argument with somebody, you're still welcomed onto the marae. You're still fed and watered, and you're still greeted. And so, you know, the notion of the 5 million showing kindness and getting through this COVID together, I think that's a strong philosophy or a process of actually, can we as a team of 5 million eliminate or, you know, eliminate racism and discrimination in our country? And I think we should continue to have hope.
Thank you, Meng. Do the other speakers wish to come in there? The point that Meng makes is that there are ground rules and changes taking places at an institutional level, but do you feel in your communities that there's what should individuals within your communities be doing about the treaty as a platform for racism? Anjum, you've been saying listening is a really good place to start. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, listening, yeah, and so that's in terms of our own self-development, right? And being aware of our own unconscious bias. But I think, yes, we need to organize, you know. And one of the things that I know, and Dave has been doing some work with me on the Christchurch Call stuff, we know that there are very strongly organized and paid campaigns to promote hate, right? These are really active campaigns. They're incredibly well resourced. They take advantage of the technology. There are people that are working hard to spread hate because it works, right? It works in terms of you know, political power, in terms of various ways of dividing people from each other. So they do that. And so the thing is, how can we organize for something better? And there are people that are doing some great work, Action Station and other organizations. So it's a matter of, again, how can we support that work? How can we organize with each other? Like, the more that we are collective in our actions against hate, the less power it has, right? So you might think, oh, what can I do personally? What can you do personally is find people who think like you and work together to have more impact. Because there are a lot of people. This is one of the tools of these campaigns, is that they want to make you think that there are lots and lots of people who hate. And so they use things like sock puppets and bots and all of these things to make you think that there are heaps of people who hate. But there really aren't. It's not as widespread as you think. So it isn't that hard to find the people that really are against this stuff and want to do something better. So that's, yeah, organize.
Listen and organize. Thanks, Anjum. A final word from Charles as we come to the end of our, or close to the end of our time.
One of the things that stands, I mean, I just agree with the things that have been said by all the speakers and by Meng. I think the theme that stands out for me is that it's so easy for us in our sorts of societies to think as individuals and not to do what Anjum has just said, you know, to organize and to get into some sort of collective action. And I think it's trying to help each other, trying to disturb that individualism, that quiet calm where people are not racist themselves in terms of their individual actions, but are actually not part of a collective that's really trying to address the structures in our society and the collectives. And I think what Anjum just said was really, really helpful, that we need to become proactive and in our various religious bodies to link with other groups, as she obviously does, and she quoted Action Stations and these groups, and do things together and make it clearer that we want to live out this vision of a much better society, and we're just not prepared to tolerate these nasty and vicious attitudes like racism.
Thank you. Meng, a concluding comment.
didn't hear you, maybe?
It's muted, I think.
Ah, thank you.
He's still muted.
Oh,
And
No.
the host has unmuted me.
Yeah,
Right.
you're ready to
Yeah.
go.
Look, it's really action that makes a difference, and I'm really looking at our children. That if they taught the values at school, that they will continue and know about the issues of racism and discrimination and how to actually combat that at a student level. I'm very hopeful that they will be able to carry that into the future, into their work life and other organisations that they are going to participate in. But we must change what we do, and I think one part is actually sharing power would be a good beginning.
Thank you. Looking at the time, we've come to an end. I want to thank Juliet, Charles, Anjum, and Meng, Dave for organisations. What's come out? We've ended on a slightly more hopeful note than I began on, which is a very good thing to do. We need to listen. We need to pursue both individual connections, but not lose sight of the larger systemic paradigms. And we need to act and both individually and in terms of the communities that we're part of and that we sometimes represent. So I'd like to just thank you all very, very much, and hope that we all get a chance to meet up in person sooner rather than later. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, good night.
Thank you.
Poor Marty.
Thank you for the
Oh,
invitation.
thank you all.